What would you do if the person you loved most asked you to leave everything behind? When a millionaire tests his fiancée's loyalty by declaring he's moving to another country, her shocking response uncovers secrets, betrayal, and an unforgettable fight for love. Are you ready to find out what happens next? The dining room was cloaked in the warm glow of candlelight. The faint hum of classical music filled the air, and the aroma of roasted duck wafted from the kitchen. Everything about the evening at Daniel Alden's estate felt orchestrated, as if meticulously designed for perfection. But beneath the polished veneer, tension simmered. Emily Carter, seated across the table, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Daniel, with his usual air of quiet confidence, poured her a glass of Pinot Noir. His blue eyes, sharp and focused, lingered on her as he sat down. There was an intensity in his gaze tonight that she couldn't quite place, something distant, almost heavy. "To us," he said, raising his glass. His voice, though steady, held a peculiar undertone. Emily hesitated but raised her glass to meet his. "To us," she echoed softly. As their glasses clinked, she searched his face for a clue, a crack in the polished mask he always wore. The first few bites of their meal passed in near silence. Emily tried to fill the void with small talk, mentioning Maeve's upcoming gallery exhibit and a funny anecdote from her art class. But Daniel's responses were curt. She felt like she was grasping at straws, her words disappearing into a void of detachment. Finally, she set her fork down, the clinking of silverware against china sharper than intended. "All right, Daniel, what's going on? You've been distracted all evening." He paused mid-bite and looked at her. For a moment, she thought he might deflect with one of his usual charming quips. Instead, he wiped his mouth with a napkin, set it down neatly, and leaned back in his chair. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice calm yet deliberate. Emily's heart skipped. The tone he used wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same measured tone he'd used when delivering news about his company's pivotal decisions or the time he decided to sell his penthouse in Manhattan. It was the tone of a man who had already made up his mind. "I've decided to sell the estate," he said, his eyes locked on hers. She blinked, confused. "Sell what? Why?" Her voice carried a mix of shock and disbelief. Daniel took a breath as if weighing his next words carefully. "Not just the estate, everything, my company, the investments, the properties, all of it." Her chest tightened. "You're selling everything?" She couldn't mask the rising alarm in her voice. "Why would you do that? You love this place. You've built everything from the ground up." "I know," he said simply, "and it's time to let it go." Emily stared at him, trying to piece together what he wasn't saying. "This doesn't make any sense, Daniel. What are you planning to do? Where will you go?" His reply came as smoothly as if he'd rehearsed it. "I've decided to move to South America. There's a small vineyard in Uruguay that I've had my eye on for years. It's modest, simple, far from all of this." She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "You're leaving? Just like that? And you didn't think to talk to me first?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's why I'm telling you now. I want you to come with me." The words hit her like a tidal wave. She sank back into her chair, stunned. "Leave everything behind? My work, my life here? For a vineyard?" Her voice wavered between disbelief and hurt. "Daniel, do you even hear yourself?" "It's not about the vineyard," he said, his tone softening. "It's about starting over, living a simpler life, away from all the noise and expectations." Emily shook her head, trying to process the magnitude of what he was asking. "But why now? Why all of a sudden? Is something wrong? Are you in trouble?" Daniel's jaw tightened, the faintest crack in his composed facade. "Nothing's wrong," he said firmly. "I've just realized that I need a change, and I want you by my side." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Emily could feel her pulse racing, her thoughts spiraling. The man she loved, the man she thought she knew, was suddenly a stranger, carrying secrets she couldn't decipher. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what if I say no?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Then I'll go alone." The room felt colder now, the warmth of the candles no longer enough to thaw the tension. Emily's mind reeled as she stared at the man she loved, the man who had just thrown her world into chaos. The study was cloaked in shadows, lit only by the dim glow of a desk lamp. Daniel sat at the massive oak desk, his head bowed, fingers steepled against his forehead. Papers were scattered across the polished surface, financial reports, property appraisals, and a handwritten letter folded in half. His mind churned, his chest tight with the weight of his decision. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Daniel glanced up, his expression hardening. "Come in." Victor Grayson stepped inside, his sharp features carved into a mask of skepticism. His tie was loosened, his suit slightly rumpled, as if he had rushed straight from a board meeting. Without waiting for an invitation, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, arms crossed. "You're really doing this?" Victor's voice was low but carried an edge of incredulity. "Selling everything, running off to Uruguay of all places?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not running. It's a decision." Victor snorted softly, pushing off the door. "You don't make decisions like this without a reason. So what's the play here? Is this about the business? Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I'm not in trouble," Daniel replied firmly, though his tone betrayed a flicker of irritation. "It's about simplifying my life, cutting ties with everything that doesn't matter." Victor stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "And Emily? Where does she fit into this grand plan of yours?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers curling into a fist on the desk. "I want her to come with me." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And if she doesn't, then I go alone." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Victor didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a dry chuckle and shook his head. "You're testing her, aren't you?" Daniel's gaze snapped up, sharp and unyielding. "That's not what this is." "Bull," Victor said, his voice rising slightly. "I know you, Daniel. You don't make moves like this without an ulterior motive. You're scared she loves the life, not you. So you're stripping it all away to see if she stays." Daniel stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Victor shot back, his tone hardening. "I've seen you do this before, with Victoria. You pushed her, tested her, until she had nothing left to prove. And when she left, you told yourself it was because she wasn't strong enough. But maybe it's you who doesn't know how to trust." Daniel's chest heaved with restrained anger. His hands braced against the edge of the desk. "This isn't about Victoria." "Isn't it?" Victor countered, stepping closer. "You're doing the same damn thing, Daniel. You're sabotaging yourself. And this time you're dragging Emily down with you." Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Daniel's gaze dropped, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I just need to know it's real." Victor exhaled sharply, the fight draining from his posture. "And if it's not, what then?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The unspoken fear lingered in the air between them, more tangible than words. Victor ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Listen, I get it. You've been burned before, but Emily isn't Victoria. You can't keep punishing her for someone else's mistakes." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "This conversation is over." "No, it's not," Victor said, his voice softening but no less insistent. "You need to hear this. If you keep pushing her away, you're going to lose her, just like you lost Victoria." Daniel's fists clenched, the veins in his hands taut against his skin. For a moment, it looked as though he might lash out, but then he stepped back, his expression cold and detached. "Thanks for your concern, Victor, but I know what I'm doing." Victor shook his head, his disappointment evident. "I hope for your sake you're right." He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "Are you sure Emily doesn't have secrets of her own?" The question hit Daniel like a slap, his composure faltering. But before he could respond, Victor was gone, leaving him alone in the dimly lit study with nothing but his thoughts and the heavy silence of the room. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the faint glow of her bedside lamp casting long shadows across the room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper in her trembling hands. She stared at the note that had been slipped into her bag earlier that evening, a scrap of paper, hastily folded with 5 ominous words scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. Ask Daniel why he's leaving. Her chest tightened. The words echoed in her mind, amplifying the unease she'd been feeling ever since his announcement. The move, the vineyard, the sudden liquidation. It all felt so rushed, so wrong. And now this? Someone knew something, but who? And why leave her this cryptic message instead of confronting Daniel directly? She unfolded the paper again, as if staring at the words long enough would yield answers. It didn't. Frustrated, she tossed it onto the nightstand and reached for her phone. Maeve. Her mentor had always been her sounding board, the voice of reason in her moments of doubt. Emily quickly dialed her number, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the phone to her ear. Emily, it's late. Are you okay? Maeve's warm voice crackled through the line. I don't know, Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel dropped this bombshell about moving, selling everything, and now I've got this note telling me to ask him why he's really leaving. Maeve, I'm scared. What if there's something he's not telling me? Maeve was silent for a moment, the weight of her pause enough to make Emily's stomach churn. Do you think he's in trouble? Financially, I mean. Emily bit her lip, the thought gnawing at her. I don't know, he says everything's fine, but this whole thing feels off. Emily, Maeve began gently, you need to talk to him, but be prepared. You might not like what you hear. The words settled heavily in Emily's chest. Thanks, Maeve. I'll figure it out. As she hung up, Emily's gaze fell back on the note, her resolve hardening. She couldn't just sit here drowning in speculation. If Daniel wasn't going to give her answers, she'd have to find them herself. She grabbed her bag and headed to the small desk in the corner of her room, where she kept a stack of files Daniel had left at her apartment a few weeks ago. She rifled through them, scanning each page for any clue, a transaction, a letter, something to make sense of it all. Most of it was routine, contracts, property deeds, financial statements, but then her eyes landed on something unusual. It was a document labeled Contingency Plan, Confidential. Her pulse quickened as she flipped it open. Inside were charts, projections, and a breakdown of assets to be liquidated in the event of a corporate crisis. A single paragraph at the bottom caught her eye. In case of severe financial instability, immediate divestiture of personal and professional holdings is recommended to safeguard key interests. Emily's heart pounded. Financial instability? Was Daniel hiding trouble at his company? Or was this just a precautionary measure? The questions swirled in her mind, each more unsettling than the last. She folded the document carefully and slipped it back into the file. A million scenarios ran through her head, none of them comforting. Was this why he was leaving? To escape a crumbling empire? And if so, why hadn't he told her? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her as she sank back onto the bed. She thought of Daniel, his calm, composed demeanor, the way he'd brushed off her questions with rehearsed ease. Was he protecting her, or was he protecting himself? The thought stung, and her chest tightened with a mix of frustration and hurt. They were supposed to be partners, equals. If he couldn't trust her with the truth, what did that say about their relationship? A knock at her apartment door startled her. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Her heart raced as she tiptoed to the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there, but when she opened the door, she found a second note folded neatly and left on the floor. This one read, "You don't know the whole story." Emily clutched the note, her mind spinning. Someone was trying to tell her something Daniel wouldn't. But who? And why now? Her hands trembled as she closed the door and locked it tightly. The weight of secrets, his and now hers, threatened to suffocate her. She sat back down, the two notes side by side on the nightstand. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, and she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her confidence, her trust, her sense of security. It all felt like it was unraveling. For the first time, she wondered if she could truly follow him, not just to South America, but down this path of uncertainty and doubt. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The buzz of polite conversation echoed through the grand hall of Daniel's estate. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the gathering of Aspen's elite. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the hum of a string quartet filled the space with understated elegance. Yet, for all its splendor, Emily felt like a stranger in a world she no longer understood. She stood near the edge of the room, her fingers clutching a glass of water she hadn't sipped. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Daniel. He had disappeared into a side room moments ago, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her doubts. "Emily, isn't it?" The smooth, calculated voice made her turn. Jonathan Webb, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, smiled at her with the confidence of a man who thrived on power plays. She nodded, her grip tightening on the glass. "That's right. I've heard so much about you," Jonathan continued, his tone polite but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Daniel's fiancé, the artist. He speaks very highly of you." Emily forced a smile. "That's kind of him." Jonathan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Tell me, how does it feel knowing everything you know about him?" Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Jonathan's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You mean he hasn't told you? Fascinating." He straightened, swirling the champagne in his glass as if the conversation were nothing more than casual banter. "Let's just say, Daniel and I have a complicated history. I'm sure you'll hear about it sooner or later." Before she could press further, the sound of a gavel striking wood silenced the room. All eyes turned to the raised platform where the auctioneer stood, his voice booming through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. The auction is about to begin." Emily's pulse quickened as she turned back to the stage. She spotted Daniel emerging from the side door, his expression unreadable as he made his way to the front. He didn't glance in her direction. The first item up for bid was a sculpture. Modern, abstract, and worth more than Emily's yearly salary. Bidding began, fast and furious, with numbers flying higher than she could track. It was a spectacle, and yet Emily couldn't shake the sense that something deeper was at play. As the auction continued, the tension in the room grew. The items on display weren't just valuable, they were personal. A vintage record player, a collection of first-edition books, even a framed photograph of Daniel with his late parents. Each item told a story, a piece of his life laid bare for the highest bidder. When the photograph appeared, Emily's chest tightened. She hadn't seen it before, a candid shot of Daniel as a boy standing between his parents in front of a small, unassuming house. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, his mother's arm around his waist. The smile on young Daniel's face was wide and unguarded, a stark contrast to the man she knew now. "This photograph, capturing a moment from Mr. Alden's childhood, is a truly unique piece," the auctioneer declared. "Shall we start the bidding at $10,000? The room murmured, a few hands raising. Emily's heart pounded as she watched the bids climb. 15,000, 20, 30. Jonathan raised his hand casually, his gaze darting to Daniel, whose jaw tightened at the gesture. 50,000, Jonathan said smoothly, his voice cutting through the murmur like a knife. Emily's breath caught. She didn't know what possessed her, but before she could think, her hand shot up. 60. A hush fell over the room. Jonathan turned to her, eyebrows raised in amusement. Daniel's head snapped in her direction, his expression a mix of surprise and something she couldn't decipher. 60,000. Do I hear 70? The auctioneer prompted. Jonathan smiled, raising his hand. 70. Emily's heart raced. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down. She raised her hand again. 80. The room buzzed with whispers. Daniel's gaze bore into her, and for a moment she thought he might step in, say something, stop her, but he didn't. 90,000, Jonathan said, his tone almost bored. Emily hesitated. Her palms were clammy, her throat dry. But then she thought of the note, the warning to ask Daniel why he was leaving. If this was her way of finding answers, so be it. 100,000, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then shrugged, a smirk tugging at his lips as he lowered his hand. Well played, he said softly, though the words were clearly meant for Daniel. Sold, the auctioneer announced, his gavel striking the podium, to the lady in blue for $100,000. Emily felt the blood rush to her ears as the crowd erupted into polite applause. Her hands trembled as she set the glass of water down, avoiding the stares of those around her. Daniel approached her slowly, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a growl. "What the hell are you doing?" "Finding out what you won't tell me," she replied, her voice just as low but laced with defiance. The car glided smoothly along the winding road, headlights cutting through the inky darkness of the Aspen countryside. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles whitening with the force. The weight of the auction, Jonathan's provocations, and Emily's defiance clung to him like a shroud. He couldn't shake the look in her eyes, challenging, questioning, searching for truths he wasn't ready to give. His chest tightened as the road bent sharply, revealing a hidden turnoff. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as he pulled up to a secluded overlook, the city lights of Aspen twinkling faintly in the distance. This was where he always came when the walls of his carefully constructed life began to close in. Daniel stepped out into the cold night air, the briskness biting at his face. He walked to the edge of the overlook, his breath visible in the faint moonlight. The silence enveloped him, but it wasn't comforting. It was deafening. His mind drifted back, years ago, to a time he had buried, but never truly forgotten. Victoria's laugh echoed in his memory, light and carefree. He could see her now, sitting in the sunlit living room of their Denver home, flipping through a book of vacation destinations. "What do you think, Daniel? Greece? Italy? Or should we go somewhere more adventurous?" He had barely glanced up from his laptop, engrossed in emails and stock updates. "Wherever you want," he had replied absently, his voice void of warmth. "You choose." He hadn't noticed the flicker of disappointment cross her face then, but he saw it now, clear as day, etched into his recollection like a scar. The memories shifted. It was no longer sunny. The house was dim, and the air felt heavy. Victoria stood in the doorway, a suitcase by her side. Her voice trembled, thick with anger and sadness. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. You don't need a wife, you need a mirror, someone to reflect your success back at you." "Don't be dramatic," he had snapped, his tone sharp, defensive. But her words had cut deeper than he let on. "This isn't love," she had whispered before walking out the door. The sound of it closing behind her still echoed in his mind, a final punctuation to a chapter of his life he thought he'd moved past. But had he? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the cold night air doing little to quell the heat of his frustration. Victoria's departure had been a wake-up call, a painful lesson in vulnerability. He had sworn never to let himself feel that powerless again. But instead of learning to trust, he had built walls, high and impenetrable. And now Emily stood on the other side of those walls, knocking, waiting. Would she stay long enough for him to open the door? Or was he destined to repeat the same mistakes? The sharp buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. He fished it out of his pocket, the screen lighting up with Victor's name. Daniel hesitated before answering. "What is it?" he asked, his tone clipped. "We have a problem," Victor replied, his voice low, urgent. "Jonathan's not done. He's been talking to board members. He's spreading rumors about the company's financial stability, trying to get them to sell their shares." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "Of course he is. The auction wasn't enough humiliation for him. He wants everything." "He's playing dirty, Daniel," Victor warned. "And if you're not careful, he'll win." Daniel clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Jonathan's game wasn't just about money. It was about control. And Daniel had handed him the perfect opening by selling off his assets. He cursed under his breath, the weight of his decisions pressing harder against his chest. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice cold, resolute. "Daniel," Victor's tone softened, hesitant. "You're not just fighting him. You're fighting yourself. Don't let this turn into another Victoria." The mention of her name hit him like a punch to the gut. "This has nothing to do with her," he snapped. "Doesn't it?" Victor challenged. "You're testing Emily the same way you tested Victoria, and you're not just going to lose her, you're going to lose everything." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his reflection distorted in the screen. Victor's words gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't just battling Jonathan's schemes or Emily's doubts. He was battling the shadows of his own past, the fears, the failures, The choices that had left him standing here, alone on a cold mountainside. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he could win. The crowd at the auction hall began to thin as the night wore on. But the tension hung in the air, heavier than before. Emily stood near the edge of the room, gripping her clutch tightly, her mind spinning from the confrontation with Daniel. She hadn't meant to bid on the photograph to provoke him, but now everything felt like a game she didn't understand. Emily! She turned sharply at the voice, her breath catching in her throat. Standing before her was a woman with sharp green eyes, an elegant posture, and a presence that exuded authority. Her auburn hair, touched with hints of gray, was swept into a neat chignon. She extended her hand, a polite but unreadable smile on her lips. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victoria." The name struck Emily like a bolt of lightning. She knew it instantly. Daniel's ex-wife, the woman he rarely mentioned, the ghost lingering in his silences. Emily hesitated before taking the offered hand, her grip faltering under the weight of sudden unease. "Victoria," she repeated, her voice barely audible. I've heard about you." "Likewise," Victoria replied smoothly, her gaze steady, almost piercing. "Though I suspect I know more about you than you do about me." Emily's heart pounded. There was an air of calculation in Victoria's demeanor, as if she were a chess master assessing her next move. "What are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice firmer now. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her smile fading, watching, observing, and perhaps trying to understand. Understand what? Why Daniel seems intent on repeating the same mistakes. The words felt like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Emily's breath hitched, her defenses rising. "I don't know what you mean." Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think this auction, this move to South America is about starting fresh? It's not. It's about control. It always is with Daniel." Emily stiffened, her chest tightening. "You don't know him anymore, don't I?" Victoria's laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Let me guess. He told you this is about simplifying his life, about finding clarity. Did he also tell you that he's terrified of being vulnerable? That he'd rather destroy something good than risk losing it?" Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. "That's not true. He's complicated, yes, but he hasn't told you the truth," Victoria interrupted, her tone sharp but not unkind. "He never does, not until it's too late." Emily's mind raced, every interaction with Daniel replaying in her head. The half-answers, the guarded expressions, the sudden move. Was Victoria right? Was she falling into the same pattern Daniel had laid out before? Victoria sighed, her expression softening. "Look, I'm not here to attack him. Daniel has his reasons for being the way he is. He's been hurt, deeply. But if you're waiting for him to let you in, you may be waiting forever." Emily's eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" "I want you to know what you're up against," Victoria said simply. "You love him, that's clear. But love alone isn't enough, not with Daniel. He needs trust, yes, but more than that, he needs someone strong enough to call him out when he's wrong." "And you weren't strong enough?" The question slipped out before Emily could stop herself. Victoria's lips curved into a faint, rueful smile. "No, I wasn't. I tried, but Daniel has a way of shutting people out. I wasn't ready to fight that battle." She paused, her gaze softening. "But maybe you are." Emily's throat tightened, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. "He's not a bad person," she said, more to herself than to Victoria. "He's just scared." Victoria nodded. "He is. But fear doesn't excuse what he's doing to you. Testing your love, your loyalty. It's cruel. If you let it continue, it will destroy you too." Emily looked away, her thoughts a chaotic mess. She wanted to defend him, to push back against Victoria's words, but something inside her whispered that they held a sliver of truth. Was she fighting for a man who couldn't fight for himself? Victoria reached out, placing a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "Whatever happens, just remember this. It's okay to walk away if it becomes too much. Loving someone shouldn't mean losing yourself." The words hit Emily with a force she wasn't prepared for. She nodded mutely, her voice failing her. Victoria squeezed her shoulder once before stepping back, her presence lingering even as she walked away. Emily stood frozen, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The crowd around her felt distant, like a blur of meaningless noise. She clutched her clutch tighter, her breath shaky. For the first time, she wasn't just questioning Daniel. She was questioning herself. The tension in the auction hall had thinned with the departure of most guests, but for Daniel, it felt heavier than ever. He stood in a quiet corridor outside the main room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The polished marble floors reflected the faint golden glow of chandeliers, but nothing about the scene felt warm. His jaw clenched as he replayed the events of the night. Emily's bold bid, Jonathan's smug satisfaction, Victoria's unexpected reappearance. It all churned in his gut like a toxic brew. A voice broke through his thoughts, low and urgent. "We need to talk." Daniel turned sharply to see Victor, his usually calm expression etched with something darker, anxiety or perhaps guilt. Daniel frowned, his defenses rising instinctively. "What is it now?" Victor glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "Not here. Come with me." Without waiting for a response, Victor strode down the hallway toward a side room. Daniel hesitated for a beat before following, his gut tightening with every step. As soon as the door closed behind them, Victor spun to face him, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Jonathan's been talking to the board. He's trying to undermine your position, spreading lies about the company's stability." Daniel's chest tightened. "I figured as much. He's always been a snake." "It's worse than that," Victor pressed, his tone sharp. "He's using the auction to fan the flames. He's saying you're liquidating everything because you've run out of options, that you're hiding financial troubles." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "And the board believes him?" "Some of them," Victor admitted reluctantly. "He's persuasive. And let's face it, Daniel, this auction doesn't exactly scream confidence." Daniel's glare was icy. "You think I don't know what I'm doing?" Victor held his ground, his voice steady but firm. "I think you're playing right into his hands." The room fell silent, the weight of Victor's words hanging in the air. Daniel paced to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens below. "Jonathan doesn't care about the company. He just wants to see me fail. And he's not the only one," Victor said quietly. Daniel turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Victor hesitated, his usual composure faltering. "There's something else, something I should have told you sooner." Daniel's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Victor, what did you do?" Victor took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as if bracing for impact. "I met with Jonathan." The words hit Daniel like a blow, his pulse spiking. "You what?" "I didn't betray you," Victor said quickly, his hands raised in a placating gesture, at least not intentionally. "He came to me weeks ago, before the auction plans were finalized. He said he wanted to collaborate, offered to buy out the remaining shares I manage on your behalf." Daniel's voice was ice. "And you didn't think to tell me?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I didn't take him seriously at first, but when I realized how far he was willing to go, when I saw how he was positioning himself with the board, I tried to contain the damage." "By meeting with him behind my back?" Daniel's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "Do you have any idea how this looks? How it feels to know my closest ally is holding secret meetings with the man trying to ruin me?" "I was trying to protect you," Victor snapped, his own patience wearing thin. "Jonathan is dangerous, Daniel. You've always known that. If I hadn't agreed to meet him, he would have gone straight to the board with fabricated evidence of your supposed instability. At least this way, I've been able to keep him at arm's length." Daniel's hands curled into fists, his teeth grinding together. "And now? What does he have on you?" Victor's gaze flickered, the faintest crack in his facade. "He's been implying things, that he has documents tying you to unethical practices. I know they're lies, but if he convinces the board otherwise—" "Enough," Daniel growled, cutting him off. His head was spinning, anger and betrayal colliding in a storm of emotions. "I'll handle Jonathan, but you—" He pointed a finger at Victor, his tone hard. "You don't move a muscle without running it by me first. Are we clear?" Victor nodded slowly, his expression somber. "Crystal." The door opened suddenly, and Emily stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the tension in the air told her she had walked in on something significant. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. Daniel straightened, his expression shifting into one of cold detachment. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Daniel," she pressed, stepping closer. "Don't shut me out." He met her gaze, the conflict in his eyes momentarily breaking through the mask. "I can't do this right now, Emily." Her chest tightened at the dismissal, but she didn't back down. "You're making it impossible to stand by you. I'm trying, Daniel, but you keep shutting me out." Victor cleared his throat, sensing the moment was no longer his to witness. "I'll leave you two to talk," he said, slipping past Emily and out the door. Emily turned back to Daniel, her frustration mounting. "When are you going to stop pretending you can handle everything alone?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply turned away, his shoulders rigid, his silence more telling than any words could have been. The night air was biting as Emily stepped out of Daniel's estate. Her heels clicked against the gravel driveway, a rhythmic echo of the storm raging inside her. She clutched her coat tightly, but the cold didn't bother her as much as the heaviness in her chest. Each breath felt sharp, cutting through her resolve, but she didn't stop. She needed to get away. "Emily, wait!" Daniel's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the quiet night. She froze but didn't turn. Her heart thundered as she heard his footsteps approach. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "Why should I wait? So you can lie to me again?" His breath was uneven when he reached her, the glow from the estate casting long shadows between them. "I'm not lying to you," he said, his tone pleading, but it lacked conviction. "I just can't explain everything right now." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You can't or you won't, Daniel, because all I've been doing is standing by you, waiting, trusting, and all you've done is push me further away." Daniel flinched at her words, his gaze dropping for a moment before he straightened. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "From Jonathan? From Victor? Or from the truth about whatever it is you're hiding?" He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us, it's bigger than that." Emily shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "No, Daniel, it's always about you. Your fears, your need for control, your endless games. Do you even know how exhausting it is to love someone who won't let themselves be loved?" Daniel's jaw tightened, his defenses rising instinctively. "You think this is easy for me? You think I enjoy this? Then why?" she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "Why are you making it so hard for me to stay?" The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes held hers, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? Regret? Whatever it wasn't enough. Emily's breath hitched as she stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't do this anymore." "Emily, don't." Daniel reached for her, but she stepped out of his grasp, the pain in her chest sharp and unrelenting. "No," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to ask me to stay while you keep shutting me out. I deserve better than this. Better than you." Her words struck like a blade, and she saw the hurt flash across his face, but she didn't let it stop her. She turned and began walking toward her car, her legs trembling with every step. Behind her, Daniel stood frozen, his silhouette a stark reminder of everything she was leaving behind. As she reached the driver's seat, her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys. She paused, gripping the doorframe as a sob escaped her lips. Her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, steadying her resolve. "Emily." His voice was softer now, barely above a whisper, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. She slid into the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she started the engine. The hum of the motor felt louder than it should, filling the empty silence between them. As she pulled away, she caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his head bowed, as if the weight of the moment had finally crushed him. For a fleeting second, she wanted to turn back, to comfort him, to tell him she still loved him. But she didn't. The road ahead was dark and unfamiliar, much like the future she now faced without him. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept driving. the ache in her chest growing heavier with every mile she put between them. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her apartment, she sat in the car for a long time, the engine idling as her thoughts raced. Her love for Daniel hadn't disappeared, but it had been buried beneath layers of hurt, distrust, and exhaustion. She didn't know if she could ever unearth it again. Climbing the stairs to her apartment, she felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the quiet of her home felt hollow. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving with silent sobs. She had thought leaving him would bring relief, but all she felt was an unbearable emptiness. For the first time in years, she was truly alone. The sterile fluorescent lights of Victor's office cast a harsh glow over the room, making the stacks of papers and files on his desk seem even more chaotic. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. His finger hovered over the call button, hesitation written across his features. He had crossed lines before, but this was different. Jonathan's voice echoed in his mind from their last conversation, smug and dripping with malice. "Just step aside, Victor. You're smart enough to know Daniel's house of cards is falling. Don't let yourself get buried in the rubble." Victor slammed the phone down onto the desk, frustration surging through him. For weeks, he'd been trying to walk a tightrope, balancing loyalty to Daniel and the growing threat Jonathan posed. But now he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. He didn't respond immediately, but the door creaked open anyway. Daniel stepped in, his expression as stormy as Victor felt inside. "We need to talk," Daniel said, his tone brooking no argument. Victor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This isn't the time." "Make it the time." Daniel's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. He closed the door behind him, folding his arms across his chest. "You've been dodging me since the auction, and I'm done waiting." Victor gestured to the pile of papers on his desk. "You think I've been dodging you? I've been cleaning up your mess, Daniel." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "My mess? Don't pretend you're innocent in all of this. I know about your meetings with Jonathan." Victor stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "And you think I enjoyed that? You think I wanted to sit across from that snake and listen to him gloat about tearing you down? You still did it," Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "You still sat there and let him think you'd betray me." Victor's hand slammed against the desk, his voice booming. "Because someone had to. You've been too busy playing your little mind games with Emily to see the real threat. While you've been testing her love, Jonathan's been testing your empire, and you didn't even notice." The words hung heavy in the air, a brutal truth that Daniel couldn't deny. He stepped back, his arms dropping to his sides, the fight draining out of him. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I didn't ask you to play the hero." Victor's shoulders sagged, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I know, but I couldn't just stand by and watch everything fall apart. Not again." Daniel frowned, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. "What do you mean, not again?" Victor hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Do you remember your first big financial crisis? The one that almost cost you your company?" "Of course I remember," Daniel said, his tone clipped. "What about it?" "You weren't the one who saved it," Victor admitted, his voice soft. "I was. I took risks you didn't even know about, called in favors, made deals I swore I'd never make, all to keep you afloat, and I'd do it again if I had to." Daniel stared at him, stunned into silence. Victor's gaze didn't waver, the sincerity in his eyes cutting through Daniel's defenses. "You've always been too proud to admit when you need help," Victor continued, his tone steady. "But that pride is going to cost you everything. Your company, your relationships, even Emily. You're so focused on proving you don't need anyone that you're driving everyone away." Daniel sank into the chair opposite Victor's desk, his head in his hands. The truth of Victor's words was a bitter pill to swallow, but he couldn't deny it. He had been pushing everyone away, too afraid to let them see the cracks in his armor. "What do I do?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor leaned forward, his expression softening. "You start by trusting me. Let me handle Jonathan. I've already gathered enough evidence to discredit him with the board. All I need is your approval to move forward." Daniel looked up, his gaze searching Victor's face. For the first time in a long time, he saw not just a business partner, but a friend. Someone who had been fighting for him, even when he didn't deserve it. "Okay," Daniel said finally, his voice firm. "Do it." Victor nodded, relief washing over him. "And Daniel?" He hesitated, then continued. "Talk to Emily. Stop pushing her away before it's too late." Daniel swallowed hard, the thought of Emily's tear-streaked face flashing in his mind. "I'll try." Victor gave him a faint smile. "That's all I'm asking." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. The auction hall was silent, an almost eerie stillness filling the air as the final item was wheeled onto the stage. The murmurs and scattered applause that had accompanied previous lots were gone, replaced by a palpable tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just another item. This was the item, the centerpiece of Daniel Alden's carefully curated collection. A simple watch, gold, understated, and worn with age, its significance was far greater than its modest appearance. It had belonged to Daniel's father, a memento from a man whose shadow still loomed large over his life. Emily sat in the crowd, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart raced, her emotions a storm of anger, heartbreak, and an odd, lingering ache of hope. She watched as the auctioneer adjusted his microphone, his voice carrying over the audience with a rehearsed air of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now present the final lot of the evening. This heirloom timepiece was a treasured possession of Mr. Alden's late father, a symbol of legacy, endurance, and time itself. Legacy." The word pierced through Emily like a blade. Legacy was what Daniel clung to, wasn't it? The legacy of his family, his company, his image. And yet, he was willing to auction it all off, every fragment of his past, without ever fully explaining why. "The bidding will start at $20,000, the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 20? A hand shot up immediately from the center of the room. Emily recognized the bidder instantly, Jonathan Webb. "20,000, the auctioneer acknowledged, his tone steady. "Do I hear 30? Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. He didn't bother to look around the room. This bid wasn't about winning the watch, it was about winning the moment. About taking something from Daniel that no amount of wealth could replace. Emily's chest tightened as the numbers climbed. 30, 40, 50. Jonathan's hand rose each time, unfaltering, while the rest of the room hesitated. The watch wasn't just valuable, it was personal. Everyone knew it, and for that very reason, no one dared challenge him. Until she did. 80,000! Emily's voice rang out, strong and clear, cutting through the growing tension. The room turned to her in unison, a wave of disbelief rippling through the crowd. Even Jonathan faltered, his smug smile slipping for the briefest moment. On stage, Daniel's expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. 90,000, Jonathan countered, his voice dripping with condescension. He glanced at Emily then, his smirk returning. Careful, dear. You're playing in a league above your means. Emily's jaw tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She refused to let him intimidate her. 100,000. A collective gasp filled the room. The auctioneer's hand trembled as he noted the bid, his professionalism wavering under the weight of the moment. $100,000 going once? Jonathan hesitated, his smug facade cracking. For a moment, he appeared to weigh his options, but then, with an exaggerated shrug, he leaned back and folded his arms. Let her have it, he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. It's just a watch, after all. Emily's breath caught as the auctioneer brought his gavel down. Sold to the lady in the back for $100,000. Applause erupted, hesitant at first but growing louder. Emily barely registered it. Her focus was locked on Daniel, who hadn't moved from his spot near the stage. His gaze burned into hers, a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't place. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel approached her, his movements deliberate. When he finally stood before her, the noise of the room seemed to fade away. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "I was thinking someone should care enough to keep it," she shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can't just throw away everything that matters to you, Daniel." His jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," she interrupted, her voice rising. "Because right now all I see is a man so afraid of being vulnerable that he's willing to destroy everything just to prove he doesn't need anyone." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with restrained emotion. For a moment, she thought he might say something, anything, that could bridge the growing chasm between them. But instead, he shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Enjoy the watch," he said finally, his tone cold. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. Emily looked down at the paddle still clutched in her hand. The victory felt hollow, the silence between them more deafening than any applause could ever be. The boardroom was a sharp contrast to the grandiosity of the auction hall. Its sterile, modern decor lacked the warmth of Daniel's estate, but the tension in the air was just as palpable. Emily sat at one end of the long glass table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Around her, the board members murmured in low voices, their faces a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Jonathan Webb leaned casually against the far wall, exuding his usual smug confidence. His voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not waste any more time. The facts are clear. Daniel Alden's recent actions have demonstrated a lack of stability, both financially and as a leader. It's time we consider new management to safeguard the company's future." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Emily's heart pounded as she glanced at Victor, who sat stiffly at her side. He gave her a faint nod, silently urging her to speak. She cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the noise. "If I may," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. The room quieted as all eyes turned to her. Even Jonathan seemed momentarily caught off guard. "I know I'm not a member of this board," she continued, her tone firm, "but I am someone who has seen firsthand what Daniel Alden has built. Not just a company, but a legacy. And I won't stand by while that legacy is torn apart by lies and manipulation." Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "With all due respect, Miss Carter, this is a corporate matter. Emotional appeals won't change the facts." Emily's gaze snapped to him, her eyes blazing. "Facts? You mean the rumors you've been spreading to further your own agenda? The fabricated evidence you've dangled in front of these people to undermine Daniel's reputation?" The room fell into stunned silence. Jonathan's smirk faltered, his composure slipping for the first time. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his voice tightening. "It's not an accusation. It's the truth," Emily shot back. She turned to the board members, her voice rising with conviction. "Daniel has always acted with integrity, even when it came at a personal cost. He built this company from nothing, and he did it with the kind of vision and determination that few people possess. But people like Jonathan don't care about that. They see an opportunity to seize power, no matter who they hurt in the process." One of the board members, an older man with a sharp suit and a thoughtful expression, leaned forward. "Do you have any proof to back up these claims, Miss Carter?" Victor straightened in his seat, sliding a folder across the table. "We do." The board members exchanged glances as the folder was passed around, its contents examined with growing interest. Jonathan's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the tide began to shift. Emily seized the moment. "Daniel Alden is not perfect. He's made mistakes. He's human. But those mistakes don't define him, and they certainly don't disqualify him from leading this company. What does disqualify someone is dishonesty, greed, and the willingness to destroy everything in pursuit of power." Her voice softened as she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "I've seen Daniel at his lowest. I've seen him wrestle with doubt and fear, and I've seen him rise above it. That's the kind of leader this company needs, not someone who takes the easy road, but someone who fights for what's right." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of her words settling over the room. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling as the board members murmured among themselves. Finally, the older man spoke again, his tone measured. "Miss Carter, your passion is evident, but why should we believe you? What makes you so certain of Daniel's ability to lead?" Emily took a deep breath, her hands unclenching as she met his gaze. "Because I love him, and I wouldn't be standing here if I didn't believe in him. With all my heart." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then one by one, the board members began to nod, their expressions shifting from doubt to resolve. Jonathan's face was a mask of fury as he realized he had lost. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, pushing away from the wall and storming out of the room. Emily felt her shoulders sag with relief as the tension finally broke. Victor placed a hand on her arm, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," he said softly. She managed a faint smile, though her thoughts were already drifting to Daniel. This victory wasn't for her, it was for him. And she only hoped he would see it for what it was. A stand not just for his company, but for the man she knew he could be. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fireplace. Shadows flickered across the wooden walls, stretching and shifting as the fire crackled. Daniel stood near the window, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. He hadn't turned on the lamps when he arrived, and the cold seeped into the room despite the fire's warmth. He had been waiting. The knock at the door was hesitant but deliberate. Daniel's shoulders tensed. He knew it was her. "Come in," he called, his voice low and steady. The door creaked open and Emily stepped inside. Her coat was dusted with snow, her cheeks flushed from the biting wind. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. "You wanted to talk," she said, her tone cautious. Daniel nodded, gesturing toward the couch. "Sit." Emily moved slowly, her posture stiff. She sat at the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel stayed where he was, leaning against the windowsill. The distance between them felt vast, though the room was small. "Thank you for what you did," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "At the board meeting." Emily's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Maybe both. "I didn't do it for you," she replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Daniel flinched at the sharpness of her words. He took a step closer but stopped himself, unsure of how to proceed. "You didn't have to stand up for me, especially after everything I've put you through." She laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the air. "You're right, I didn't have to, but I did, because I believed in you, Daniel, even when you gave me every reason not to." Her words hit him like a blow and he exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. "Emily, do you have any idea how hard it's been?" she interrupted, her voice trembling. "To love someone who refuses to let me in, to stand by you while you push me away over and over again." Daniel stepped closer, his expression pained. "I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" Emily's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "From the truth? From your fears? Don't you see that keeping me in the dark only made it worse?" He sank into the armchair opposite her, his head in his hands. "I didn't know how to let you in. Every time I've trusted someone, it's blown up in my face. I was scared, Emily, scared of losing you." Her breath hitched, and she leaned forward, her voice softening. "You were so scared of losing me that you never gave me the chance to stay." The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the words they hadn't said. Daniel looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made so many mistakes, I don't even know where to start fixing them." Emily's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but she didn't let herself soften completely. "It's not just about saying you're sorry, Daniel. It's about showing me that you're willing to change." He nodded slowly, his gaze locked on hers. "I don't want to lose you, Emily. Tell me what I need to do." She hesitated, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she spoke, her tone steady but firm. "You need to stop hiding from me, from yourself. If we're going to have any chance at a future, you have to let me in, all the way." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'll try," he said, his voice cracking. I don't know if I can do it perfectly, but I'll try. Emily's lips trembled and she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. That's all I've ever wanted. For you to try. For the first time in what felt like forever, the distance between them began to shrink. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let his touch ground her, a small gesture of hope amid the sea of uncertainty. Can we start over? He asked, his voice tentative. Emily met his gaze, her expression soft but guarded. We can start, but only if you mean it. I do, he said, his tone resolute. I don't want to lose you, Emily. Not again. The fire crackled softly in the background as they sat there, the weight of their past still lingering but no longer suffocating. For the first time, there was a glimmer of possibility, a chance to rebuild what they had nearly lost. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of Daniel's laptop. He sat hunched over his desk, his face illuminated by the screen, eyes scanning the document Victor had sent earlier. The evidence against Jonathan was damning. Emails, bank transfers, backdoor agreements, it was all there, laid bare in meticulous detail. But one folder caught his attention. It wasn't labeled with Jonathan's name, but with Emily's. His breath hitched as his cursor hovered over it. A storm of hesitation brewed in his chest. He had no right to open it, no reason to pry into her past. But doubt, like an unrelenting whisper, gnawed at him. What if there was something he didn't know, something that could change everything? With a click, the folder opened. Inside were scanned documents, hospital records, a debt ledger, and a photograph of a young girl standing outside a modest home. The girl's face was familiar, Emily, but she was younger, her expression somber, her eyes filled with a mix of innocence and quiet pain. Daniel scrolled further. The hospital records detailed a history of financial struggles stemming from Emily's mother's illness. Bills left unpaid, loans taken out against the house, a foreclosure notice. He exhaled sharply, guilt pressing against his chest. She had carried this weight alone and never said a word. Another document caught his eye, a court transcript. As he read, the pieces began to fall into place. Emily's father had abandoned the family when she was a teenager, leaving them with nothing. She had worked tirelessly to help her mother keep what little they had, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. Her silence about her struggles wasn't out of pride, but survival. She had learned to bear burdens alone because no one had been there to share them. The sound of the door opening startled him. Emily stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from curious to guarded when she saw the open laptop. Her eyes darted to the screen, then back to him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight. Daniel hesitated, his guilt evident. "Victor sent me the files on Jonathan, and I found this." Emily's face paled and she stepped forward, her arms wrapping protectively around herself. "You had no right." "I know," he interrupted, his voice heavy with regret. "I shouldn't have. But Emily, why didn't you tell me about your mother, the debts, your father?" Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, her shoulders stiff. "Because it's not who I am anymore. That part of my life, it's over. I didn't want you to see me as someone who needed saving." Daniel rose from his chair, closing the laptop as he stepped closer. "You think I'd see you that way? Emily, this," he gestured to the screen, "this doesn't make me think less of you. If anything, it makes me admire you more." She met his gaze then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't understand. I fought so hard to leave that behind, to build something for myself. Telling you would have made it real again." Daniel reached for her hands, his grip gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Don't you see? All this time I thought I was the one keeping us apart. But you were keeping walls up too." Emily's defenses cracked, a sob escaping her lips as she collapsed into his arms. "I didn't want to lose you," she whispered. "I was so afraid you'd see me as broken." He held her tightly, his chin resting against her hair. "We're all broken, Emily, but that doesn't mean we can't be whole together." For a moment they stood in silence, their breaths mingling, their hearts beating in sync. The secrets they had kept, his fears, her past, no longer held power over them. The walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, replaced by something fragile but real. When Emily finally pulled back, her cheeks were streaked with tears, but her expression was resolute. "We have to stop hiding from each other, Daniel. If we're going to make this work, we can't keep running from our pasts." He nodded, his voice steady. "No more secrets, no more running." They stood together in the dimly lit room, their shadows intertwined on the wall behind them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time they were ready to face it, together. The airport buzzed with muted chaos, a symphony of announcements, shuffling luggage, and hurried conversations. Emily stood just beyond the security checkpoint, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she scanned the crowd. She had almost turned back twice, her heart warring with her head, but something stronger had pulled her here, a need for closure, for clarity, for Daniel. Her breath hitched when she finally spotted him. Daniel stood near the departure gate, his figure tall and stoic against the backdrop of bustling travelers. He looked different, tired perhaps, or simply resigned. The weight of his decision hung heavy in the space between them. "Daniel!" Her voice cut through the din, and he turned sharply, his eyes widening with surprise. She moved toward him quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. When she reached him, the air between them felt charged, alive with everything unsaid. "Emily!" His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he couldn't believe she was standing there. "What are you doing here?" She searched his face, looking for answers. "I could ask you the same thing. Is this it, Daniel? You're just going to leave, walk away from everything?" His jaw tightened, and he glanced down, his hands flexing at his sides. "I thought that's what you wanted." "What I wanted?" Her voice rose, incredulous. "I wanted you to stop running, to face the truth about yourself, about us." "I am facing it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "That's why I have to go. I've been holding on to things for too long. My father's legacy, the company, the fear of losing you. I need to figure out who I am without all of it." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And you think you'll find that by running to South America? By leaving me behind?" Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers with a rare vulnerability. "I don't want to leave you behind, but I can't ask you to follow me either. It wouldn't be fair." Emily's hands balled into fists at her sides. "Fair? You think this is about fairness? This is about trust, Daniel. About choosing to fight for what we have instead of running away from it." "I'm not running," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm trying to start over." She stepped closer, her voice softening but no less firm. "You don't start over by abandoning the people who love you. You start over by letting them in, by letting them help you carry the weight." Daniel's breath hitched, and for a moment he looked as if he might break. But then his expression hardened, his walls rising once again. "You deserve more than this," he said, his voice low. "More than me." Emily's heart cracked at the words, but she refused to give up. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling. "I do deserve more. I deserve a man who's willing to fight for us, who's brave enough to stay even when it's hard." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling before her eyes. He took a step closer, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to be that man." "You already are," she replied, tears finally spilling over. "You just don't see it yet." Silence stretched between them, heavy with emotion. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch tentative but desperate. "Emily," he began, his voice cracking, "I don't want to lose you." "Then don't," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Stop running. Stay. Let's figure this out together." He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as someone he needed to protect or test, but as an equal, a partner, someone willing to fight for him even when he couldn't fight for himself. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, but neither of them moved. Daniel glanced at the gate, then back at Emily. His grip on her hand tightened. "Okay," he said finally, his voice resolute. "I'll stay." Relief flooded Emily's face, and she stepped into his arms, her tears dampening his shirt. They stood there, holding on to each other as if letting go would shatter everything they had fought to rebuild. As the announcement for his flight faded into the background, Daniel knew he had made the right choice. For the first time, he wasn't running away. He was running towards something, toward love, toward trust, toward a future he couldn't imagine without her. The morning sun filtered through the large bay windows of Emily's apartment, casting a warm glow over the room. It was quiet except for the soft rustling of papers on the coffee table and the faint sound of a songbird chirping just outside. Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She watched Daniel across the room as he stood by the window, his silhouette bathed in golden light. He looked different, lighter, freer, as if a weight he had carried for far too long had finally been lifted. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he wore a simple sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to the polished suits that had once been his armor. "You're staring," Daniel said without turning, a small smile tugging at his lips. Emily smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm admiring," she corrected. "There's a difference." He finally turned to face her, his expression soft. "You've been quiet all morning." "I'm thinking," she admitted, setting her mug down, "about everything that's happened, about us." Daniel crossed the room, sitting beside her on the couch. "Second thoughts?" he asked, though his tone was more curious than defensive. She shook her head, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her mug. "No second thoughts, just wondering where we go from here." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was steady, grounding. "We go forward," he said simply. "Together." Emily smiled, her heart swelling at the certainty in his voice. "That sounds nice," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from a deep understanding and shared resolve. Then Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. He sighed, glancing at the screen. "Victor," he said, his tone half exasperated, half amused. "Answer it," Emily urged. "He's been a good friend." Daniel picked up the phone, placing it on speaker. "Victor." "Good morning, sunshine," Victor's voice came through, as sardonic as ever. "I hope you're ready for the meeting with the board tomorrow." Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily, his expression softening. "I'll be there. And Victor, thanks for everything." Victor paused, his voice unusually sincere when he replied, "That's what friends are for." The call ended, and Daniel set the phone back down, his gaze returning to Emily. "You were right about him," he admitted. "I didn't see it before, but he's always had my back." Emily squeezed his hand. "Sometimes we need someone else to remind us of what's right in front of us." Daniel smiled, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "And sometimes we need someone to push us to be better." She laughed softly, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "Don't go getting all sentimental on me now." "I can't help it," he teased, his smile widening. "You've changed me, Emily. You've made me want to be the man I was always too afraid to be." Her laughter faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "And you've reminded me that it's okay to lean on someone. That strength isn't about doing everything alone." They sat together for a while longer, the weight of their journey settling into something lighter, more hopeful. Finally, Emily stood, stretching as she looked around the room. "I think we should celebrate." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Celebrate what?" "This," she said, gesturing around them. "A fresh start, a new beginning." He stood as well, pulling her into his arms. "What did you have in mind?" "Something simple," she replied. "Breakfast at Maeve's Cafe, a walk through the park. No grand gestures, just us." Daniel nodded, his smile softening. "That sounds perfect." They left the apartment hand in hand, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The world around them felt brighter, the colors more vivid. It wasn't just the promise of a new day. It was the promise of a life they were building together, one step at a time. As they walked down the street, Daniel glanced at Emily, his expression serious but hopeful. "Emily?" "Hmm?" she replied, looking up at him. "I'm not going to be perfect," he admitted, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I'm going to try, every day." Her smile was radiant, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's all I've ever wanted." Their steps slowed, and he pulled her to a stop, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her lips. In that moment, The past no longer held them captive, and the future stretched out before them, unknown but full of possibility. Together they walked forward, leaving the shadows behind.